Hello, everybody. This is a look at double-edged safety razors and a couple of important points that may be ignored or are not even noticed by a lot of people when they get started and even after they've been using traditional double-edged razors for a while. So there's a debate on what makes a razor aggressive or not. And aggressive is simply the amount of blade that is poking out beyond the safety guard, which is the lowest part where this comb is here, and then the cap. So how much of this blade pokes out is generally what people think of as what causes a razor to be aggressive. And so that certainly does have an important part. It is not the only thing. So there's a little bit more going on than is necessarily obvious to most people. So I picked up a Razorock goat head with a bulldog handle recently, and so they are a small Canadian company, not nearly as large as some of the big razor companies in Germany or England. And so I personally think probably they have a little bit more hands-on, and so the razor is a little bit maybe more designed. There might be a little bit more finesse or whatnot in putting it together. It's a little bit like maybe buying a Porsche or a what is the other? I think the automobile, a Lagarin. No, that's not right. I can't remember. But there's another automobile company that is not like a privately made or completely custom made, but is kind of smaller. So as the Jagger, Mula, the big German companies, Parker in India, Weishi in China, all those are pretty well known. There's like your Fords and your GMs and your Minis and all of that. Well, there's others that are maybe a little bit more custom made, more hands work, that type of thing. And I'm thinking that's kind of what Razorock is to some extent. And so you pay slightly more for this Razorock, but I think it's considerably more designed and possibly better in how it's going to function. So this is the Razorock goat head, solid stainless steel, which is a copy of the 34C, which would be chrome, or a 34 heavy duty made in Germany, which for 70, 80 years, I think it may have been patented in 1934. That's where the name comes from. But they have recently actually come up with a 34 Inox, INOX, which is a solid stainless steel razor in a package that has a a leather sheath and some kind of nice packaging and all that. They've just recently come up with that. And so this particular head made by Razorock is a copy of that. And so historically people thought that the 34C was kind of a little bit aggressive, but not excessively so. And so Razorock has theoretically gone through and maybe used a head that is more similar to maybe some of the original 34Cs, which were, I guess, slightly aggressive. But to me, it's really a pretty mild overall. However, the point of this video is really about how there's a little bit more to aggressiveness than simply that. So this particular head has a pretty dramatic drop in the curvature, which gives you a slightly sharper angle, so you can, so the blade cuts slightly more aggressively than in kind of a more flat head. So here there is a Edwin Jaeger, not nearly as pronounced in how the curvature of the cap comes. So you have a slightly more oblique angle, and so it's going to tend to not cut in. And so the gap on the Razorock is actually not very much at all. It may even be less than this Jaeger. However, what they've done is they have exposed the blade to be slightly more into the comb on the safety bar. I've made an illustration which may or may not be easy to see. So that space or the gap in between the cap and the safety bar, how much space is in between that is sort of what we're discussing. And so the Razorock is actually quite close and even overlays the beginning of this comb slightly, quite tight. There's not necessarily a lot of space, and maybe no space at all, whereas the Jaeger, there's a little bit of space in between those. However, how the overlay of the cap and the comb really comes into play. And so not only that, but that angle of how sharp that blade approaches the safety bar is important as well, and not necessarily something that's completely obvious. So just a couple points to think about in choosing a razor. What's going to make for a aggressive blade or not aggressive blade. So again, with this Razorock, it's maybe a little bit more thinking that's going in. So they've kind of revamped or thought about, not only the amount of the blade curvature attack on the face, but also can kind of play with making that as close as possible, and also have covered more of the blade on the top, on the cap part, whereas this Jaeger, and I think a lot of more production, actually show a fair amount on the top, so the blade is going to be prone to vibrate slightly, and thus give you a less close, less reliable shave as well. So these are all important little points that may come into play and may have an effect on what you're doing. So you really do, I guess, get what you pay for, and I really do recommend, Razorock is kind of an upgrade above all the kind of production models. This particular Razorock with the goat head typically comes with what they call a bulldog handle, which is a fairly substantial and fat handle. This razor is quite heavy, much heavier than what would be average, and so some people are not going to like that. Also, Razorock has got some knurling on these handles, which is fairly grippy, which to a lot of people is going to be maybe a little bit of abrasive. The Jaeger also has kind of a fat bulldog handle, but not quite as fat as this real fat Razorock. So again, a smaller company, probably offers a little bit more value than a production line. So really, yes, it's not just about the space. However, how the entire design of the relationship between the safety bar, the gap, the amount of blade exposed, and even the cap itself comes into play. And so, as I said, I think Razorock attempted to go back to earlier for the 34 Cs, which have changed, maybe not dramatically, but have changed considerably since the early production. In the last 10, 20 years, they've played with it to try to make it more consumer friendly as well. So if you just buy one, particularly used, you don't necessarily know what the aggressiveness of that 34 C or 34, I believe also they did a G gold as well, or most recently the 34 Inox, what any of those are going to be. So you have to do a little bit of research. I'm not going to get into that, but in order to really kind of know what you're looking at. But yeah, that cap itself does in fact play a pretty important role, which the manufacturers don't even really get into that at all on the descriptions as well. So something to think about. Enjoy and do well out there.